Yo, hello. We are back once again with another one of these types of videos. I guess you want to just call them guides or something. I'm probably going to call it a guide. This time in the form of the second arcane dagger known as Arcane Tempest that we are getting on the upcoming Radiant Dawn Brigade banner. I combined those two thingies, but I mean, you get the gist of it. Arcane Tempest, the second arcane dagger. It is a slaying dagger that grants times pulse 3, not times pulse 4, because this only works at the start of the turn. It doesn't have the spiral effect. It can grant up to Spectrum 14 in stat. It has first hit damage reduction for 30%, and it works against brave attacks. And if the user is faster than the foe, it has full no follow-up built into it. Suffice to say, this is definitely more of the speedy arcane, and I think relatively speaking, compared to the Arcane Void dagger that we got, I think, roughly 6 months ago, it's definitely a bit more of an upgrade for most other units that are relatively fast. And as far as daggers are concerned, most of them are relatively fast for the most part, barring maybe a few armors and a couple other characters that don't really necessarily fall into that specific niche. But generally speaking, this weapon is probably going to be better than most available weapons they have access to at the moment, especially when comparing it to the older arcane. It does have slaying and it does grant a bunch of stats. The only difference is that this one has a guaranteed follow-up and has breath built into the weapon, which is something that is becoming easier and easier to outsource, especially now with the recent refines, inheritable skills. It's not exactly something that is necessarily as coveted as I would argue it once was, but it is still convenient to have around nonetheless. Even so, I would definitely say Arcane Void doesn't really have much going in it comparatively to the new Arcane, mostly because a lot of the effects that you could get out of Arcane Void can just be replicated through other means, whether that's through external support or inheritable skills. But generally speaking, I don't think it's a bad weapon, but I think outside of a select few units, there really isn't much reason to use Arcane Void over Arcane Tempest at this point. As far as Arcane Void users are concerned, it's pretty much dedicated to the slowest of the slow units and the armors respectively, although you could definitely make the argument that they don't even want Arcane Void. That being said, I think having the guaranteed follow-up is still relatively nice to have since it's also dual phase, and that in and of itself isn't exactly as easy to come across unless you have a crux skill, but that already places a limitation on how much stuff you could bring at the end of the day. I think for the most part, a lot of the generics just want to run Arcane Tempest, and a lot of the slower units slash armor units just kind of want to stick with Arcane Void. But again, you can still outsource a lot of stuff such as guaranteed follow-ups and breath if you would much rather run Arcane Tempest instead. I think as far as the ones that definitely want to keep their PRF though, it's a lot more self-explanatory. Most of them are relatively modern for the most part. Some of them definitely have aged a bit more comparatively, but I would still argue that using their PRF is a lot better than using Arcane Tempest. A lot of the units in the keep PRF section tend to have a player phase Brave Dagger, which is still an incredibly good asset to have. You have other ones that have refresh abilities built into their weapon, Miracle, some that just got recent refines, or refines that are still relatively decent enough, at least if you want to keep them at their niche, even if they aren't necessarily the best comparatively to other units, such as Kronia. And other than that, you still have a lot of modern units such as Nino, Yunaka, Yukimura, but otherwise it's a lot more self-explanatory for the most part. The rest of the characters not really mentioned are just kind of in the any inheritable section, and barring Air, it's just every single dancer, mostly because they don't really need any arcane, but they aren't necessarily bad with it either, and that's why I have them in the any inheritable section. There's probably a lot better options comparatively to Void and Tempest, but they aren't necessarily locked to just using one or the other, and that's just by proxy of being a support unit at the end of the day. The only unit that also isn't really being mentioned at the moment is Merlinus, but I'm gonna be frank, I don't really know if any refine is going to save him, but I mean, bigger miracles have happened, I guess. Even so, if you want to give him Arcane Void or Tempest, I don't think it's the worst thing you could do. If you really want to wait and see if he gets a decent enough refine, then be my guest. But I mean, as far as dagger units are concerned on the horizon for refines, he's the only one at the moment. So, I mean, either wait patiently or go nuts with it. The only other thing I do want to mention regarding dancers using the Arcane Tempest, or just any arcane in general, is that there is tech that you could technically do with a lot of them, assuming that their HP is low enough. Mostly in the form of even pulse tide dodging, because it has times pulse built into the weapon. So as long as you're running a 2 cooldown special, then it's always going going to target the dancer, which more often than not is going to be an incredibly beneficial thing if the skill ends up playing a key factor in pretty much anything you're doing with them. Otherwise, the one other thing I do want to mention is Ginungagap, because Arcane Tempest is actually really, really good for them. But this is on the basis that you have Marth Emblem, and this is because of their B slot. Arcane Tempest has Slang and Times Pulse built into it. And with the B slot that grants Quicken Pulse at the start of their combat, if you are running Marth Emblem, you'll be able to instantly attack with a lethality. This is already on top of their super high debuffing potential and other supportive stuff that they're already able to do. You could initiate with an instant lethality and probably do a lot more damage comparatively to just running Arcane Void. And while I wouldn't necessarily guarantee this is going to one-shot everything, it's definitely a higher bar raised for their damage output comparatively to what they had before, which is why I do want to mention it. But otherwise, I think this is going to be the list of units that I would personally recommend for each Arcane, and then the units that just don't want to use either of them. But of course, you're here to see which units kind of want to do arcane-y things with the new Arcane. Let's just talk about builds, because infantry probably are the best out of the bunch, mostly because they could stack Times Pulse up with this weapon. Although this is where I wish the Arcane had Times Pulse 4 and not Times Pulse 3, because the special looping would have been incredibly beneficial, not only to just infantry, but pretty much every dagger, period, just because of the amount of defensive pressure that you could also get out of it with stuff like Preempt. Even so, you could still run this on an infantry with Times Pulse 3 if you really wanted to, and then they could always retaliate with a Luna Preempt, or if you're running Marth Emblem, instant lethality. Otherwise, it's a lot of other miscellaneous player phase tools. You can run stuff like Finish, Desperation, Blade Session with Pledge, and then retaliate with a lethality on every second hit. You have other skills such as Flash Sparrow if you don't want to run Pledge, skills that can secure more kills such as Fatal Smoke and Pulse Up Blades for the extra attack and pulses. Oath is just a generally good buffing tool, and it gives you extra attack during combat. And you could also run stuff like Blazing Wind sets, because with the Times Pulse built into the weapon, on top of the Slang, you're inherently going to be able to charge up Blazing Winds with relative ease. You'll lose out on the Times Pulse 3 gimmick after the fact, but I think it's going to be fine regardless. Whether or not you are planning on running a Blazing Wind set nowadays, I think you do have the option now with Arcane Tempest because of how easily you could get the charges. But otherwise, it's just, again, more miscellaneous player face tools that you could use. Boost Tempo is a really good combination for shutting off specials that aren't instant or can't be jumped through, stuff like Lagoo's Friend. You have bonus doubler stacking, which is good for stats in general. Remote skills if you want to continually stack up the DR, because 30% isn't inherently a lot from the weapon, so you can still get extra from the ASAW if you really want that. Assassin Strike is a generally good player phase tool because it also grants true damage and inflicts damage at the start of the combat. Otherwise, it's a lot of other miscellaneous player phase tools you can take advantage of for your infantry. Next, you have the armors, and I mean, I think outside of Jafar, there aren't really a lot of speedy armored daggers, but you could still arguably use Arcane Tempest on every single dagger armor regardless. Even so, the most that you're probably going to get out of the armor options is going to be through its damage reduction properties. You could stack it up with stuff like Weaving Fighter and Special Fighter Sacred Seal if you really want to use that. You could also use Special Fighter 4 and something like Armored Beacon and Flow if you really just want to get your damage output and sustainability high. Although being a ranged armor isn't exactly the strongest thing, especially since they lack stuff like Hardy Fighter, and nukes are getting incredibly more difficult to deal with over the course of many more updates. Even so, you still have stuff like Distant Defense 4, which is good for removing bonuses off the foe. You have Tier 4 boosts, which are generally good for guard and HP stacking, which can work with squad seals, anything past BS, or even BS if you want to run that. Otherwise, you could run stuff like Lethality if you want to instantly retaliate with something like that. Miracle could be used for stacking, and the only other thing worth considering could be Hardy Bearing, but that would have to be with Marth Emblem, assuming that your one goal is to just survive, which a lot of the time is going to be the goal for armors. You will need Marth Emblem for this, or you could get a pulse from somewhere else, but regardless, you're going to need that extra pulse effect in order to charge up Miracle on the foe's second hit, assuming that you are getting doubled. That and Hardy Bearing prevents stuff like Firestorm Dance, which can be really, really convenient. And then you have have your cavalry options, which I think are going to bleed into the flyer ones a lot because they share a lot of the similar skill pools. Even so, you can run a lot of stuff like Flared Strike, Fatal Smoke, which is just a generally easy way of one-shotting a lot of stuff, assuming that you do enough chip damage. You can run stuff like Ruptured Sky and Moonbow, so you can instantly retaliate with a special, and if the foe counters back and you're able to double, you'll be able to get 2 specials off in one combat. You can continually stack up any sort of respective Sacred Seal that will give you the beneficial stats regardless of what unit you're using. You still have stuff like Far Trace, Lulls, Potent Disarm, which I've neglected to really talk about to this point, but it does grant you a 3rd attack akin to the likes of Marth and Ivy. Although it is on the weaker side comparatively, it is still a worthwhile consideration, even though you still have stuff like Assassin Strike and Desperation 4, which can be really good for generally securing kills or not eating hits whatsoever if you're not really convinced that your unit can live a hit with 30% damage reduction. But otherwise, it's still stuff like Insight, Fatal Smoke, Menace skills. Menace skills aren't exactly the best, but cavalry still have the leg up on that, mostly because of their high threat range. So if you did have to throw a C slot on them, I don't think Menace is the worst per se. But really, the goal should be something like Flared Sparrow, Assassin Strike, Fatal Smoke, or something that can allow you to secure damage output at a consistent rate. And flyers aren't exactly much different. The only difference is that they have access to stuff like Deadly Miasma, and they could get skills such as Unity off with much more ease, just because they're generally going to be around allies half the time. You can do a lot of the same stuff that you're doing with the Cavs, Flared Strike, Fatal Smoke, Flared Sparrow, and Deadly Miasma. I know you see this on screen, and the terrain does overlap, but in my opinion, getting the lull effect from Deadly Miasma on top of the debuff Spectrum 5 is more than worthwhile than just sacking one over the other, when you could also get 14 flared damage on top of that, just so you can secure kills at a much higher rate. That's why I have it here. I personally love Flared Sparrow, Deadly Miasma, regardless of the terrain overlap. But if you don't want to run that, you can still do stuff such as Speed Preempt with the Ruptured Sky or any sort of low cooldown special. It does have Times Pulse 3 built into it, but it will only work on the one enemy phase initiation. Otherwise, it's going to be a much more uphill battle just because you won't have your special ready for the next enemy phase. If you don't want to do anything like that, you still have all the plethora of player phase skills at your disposal. Same thing, Potent Disarm, Desperation 4, remote skills, guidance if you want to be a bit more supportive, so on and so forth. And really, as far as the Arcane is concerned, I would say that's going to be about it. Now, going into the Far Trace Echo, though, I think this is where it's going to be a lot more straightforward and simplistic, but there's still things worth talking about in my opinion if it wasn't already conveyed in the Arcane Tempest section. But first things first, one thing to know, if you're going to get this Far Trace Echo, you don't want to put it on any character that has a PRF skill unless they're a rearmed or an attuned. So you can put this on somebody like rearmed Plumeria, or you can put it on somebody like Ivy, but you cannot put it on somebody like Legendary Azura because she is not a rearmed or attuned. Just want to put that out there just in case. But as far as Far Trace Echo is concerned, it is basically Far Trace 4 in your X slot. The only difference is that it doesn't do nearly as much damage and it doesn't have stats, but having Canto remaining minimum of 1 in your X slot and freeing up your B slot for pretty much anything else is an incredibly big asset in my opinion, especially when it comes to just mobility purposes. Because one of the worst things about Far Trace 3 is that if you moved all your spaces, you just weren't going to Canto afterward. This doesn't have the same issue, which is why I think it is a worthwhile Echo. Not something that you necessarily really have to go out of your way for, but I would definitely say it's on the upper echelon of Echoes. Even so, the amount of B slot options that you do get out of it comparatively is mostly going to be dependent on whether or not you have the B slots available, because there are a lot that you could give out to any sort of ranged cav or ranged flyer. You still have stuff like Strike, Desperation, Preempt, lulls if you really want to use that. If you aren't too concerned about freeing up your B slot for pretty much anything else, you could use this to make any sort of flyer a bit more utility based. Give them guidance in the C slot and Far Trace in the X slot, and then they should be able to do any sort of reposition, guidance support, drawback, anything of the sort that would allow them to move around and provide higher range to any sort of unit that is trying to warp in. I think it is an incredibly big asset, especially for something like Summoner Duels, mostly because a lot of the time Canto is just invaluable to openings in general. Otherwise though, you could still use this for hit and run purposes. You could set up Flared Sparrow terrain and then run away with one Canto, assuming there isn't any Canto control, and then assuming that the foe is also ranged, it's going to make it a lot more difficult for them to approach you, which could really be good defensively. You also could still do the same thing with AoEs, but you will need outside pulse support. Arcane Tempest with Marth Emblem would put you at 1, but you need a quicken pulse somewhere since you will generally not have the ability to charge it otherwise. Other than that, you can pretty much just provide movement support through stuff like Annette, who could rally and grant extra movement. Granted, that doesn't work with ranged cabs, but it will work with ranged flyers. Sigurd, who has Holy Knight too, but that also works with the T version. As long as they're able to get the special off, then everybody on the field will get extra movement regardless of the archetype they're in, so that can make Far Trace way more potent, especially if there isn't any Canto control on the field. You could use stuff like Hinoka, who could grant charge, and while it does count as a warp, you'll still be able to cancel back 1 afterward with the threat range of having 3 spaces. And with Azura, she could dance and grant extra movement to pretty much everyone, I think, except barring ranged cabs, but you still have a lot of utility when it comes to granting extra movement and threat range in general. So if you do plan to use any sort of support with it, I highly recommend some of these units in particular. Really, there isn't much else to talk about when it comes to Far Trace Echo. It is very, very straightforward as a skill. You get extra B slot utility out of it. You can be a lot more supportive with your ranged flyers because of guidance support. And if you need anybody else to provide extra movement just to get in and out, then you have a lot of support options at your disposal. And really, when it comes to the brand new inheritable whatchamacallits, it's pretty much just going to be that. The ladder section was definitely a lot shorter, but I think it's very understandable why. Even so, I think this banner has a lot of really cool stuff that you can inherit to all sorts of characters, even ones that just aren't daggers. And if you do plan to summon on this banner, let me know down below who you plan to give any of these skills to. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.